Rick Ferguson.
Finland's best, amazing. That's the last time that I spoke here was 2019, and I think I walked on the stage to Hanoi Rocks then as well. So whoever's responsible, thank you. So yes, I've got half an hour to tell you about the next decade, so I'm going to try and compress it as much as possible. Project 2030 is a research project that we undertook at Trend Micro. Some of you may be familiar with a project that I was a part of. It wasn't a Trend Micro project, but I was a part of the research for it, which was called Project 2020, which predated the 2030 research. We started it in 2012 and published in 2013. When 2020 came around, we actually did a review and a retrospective of how well did we do, how did we, what did we get right, what did we get wrong, what did we completely miss, and kind of looked at the methodology of how we had done things, because we had a plan that we wanted to do it again. So we tweaked that methodology, and Project 2030 is what came out of that. It's an attempt to give practitioners, policymakers, even governments, the information that they need to take a more long-term view of technological, societal, even behavioral changes over time, so that you can develop a more nuanced strategy when it comes to preparing for that future, for that cyber future. I guess we were almost caught completely off guard, because when we were preparing, doing the initial groundwork for Project 2030, the pandemic hadn't happened, and of course none of us really knew it was coming, so we had all these grand plans as to how we were going to do it and what we were going to do. We were going to have meetings all around the world with different experts in their own industry verticals, like medical and logistics and whatever it might be. And of course then the pandemic came and kind of changed the world over the course of a couple of years. The advantage, I suppose, is that we were doing the research while that was happening. So we were able to figure into some of the long-term changes, things that came about as a result of that. So that will figure in here. What we are doing, though, with Project 2030, it's important to remember we're not trying to predict the future of one single real-world country. It's not like this is 2030 in Finland, or this is 2030 in the UK, or whatever it might be. What we've done is we've created a fictional country of Nusan, Japan, and we've brought all of our predictions together in one place, because it allows us to identify the linkages between those predictions and how they might influence one another. So the world that I'm describing might seem far-fetched, it might seem a little bit sci-fi to you, but it's a world that is, it's plausible or even probable in some parts of the world, but it's probably much further distant, or maybe even impossible in other parts of the world. So we expect to see this coming true in different ways, in different places. But for the purposes of Project 2030, we brought it all together in one country. So when you're doing an exercise like this, it's something we learned with Project 2020, it's really important to start from a solid baseline. You have to understand exactly where you are right now if you're going to project out that far into the future and actually have it be have academic rigor and have it make sense. So what we did to create that baseline, first we analyzed a lot of reports from international organizations, people like Europol, Interpol, United Nations, European Commission, these different sort of international bodies. And they were reports that were talking about what does the situation look like right now? What are the current threats? What does the ecosystem look like? What do criminal activities look like? What sorts of technologies are being abused and misused and leveraged to commit cybercrime? And that part of the baselining, we came up with a table like this. So that's like the view from the ground at the end of 2019, start of 2020. This is how cybercrime looks. And then you're probably familiar with, within our industry, within the cybersecurity industry, every year, pretty much every vendor will publish their annual predictions for the next 12 months, right? Some of them interesting, some of them less so, maybe. And also, one thing that you have to watch out for is the commercial interest that's often in a lot of those predictions. You know, you happen to be the company that sells database security, so suddenly your predictions predict an awful lot of trouble for databases next year. So the next step in this baselining was taking all of those reports published by organizations within our industry, at least all the ones that were published by January of 2020, and trying to get a sense of where the weight of industry agreement lay as to what the next 12 months would hold. And actually, from this perspective, you can look at this and decide if the industry was right or not. What we did was we took all of those reports, put them into a giant table, and where people were making the same prediction in different companies, they were getting more weighting and more sort of belief within that particular one. And I tried to weed out all of the obvious commercial ones. And I was left with these. I keep expecting them to be over there, and it's me, and it's shocking. It's over here. So this is what was predicted over the next 12 months. I think some of it you can look at it and say, yep, we've seen that's happening, or at least we're seeing the beginnings of it. Some of it maybe less so, and some of it's kind of obvious. Ransomware continues, double extortion, triple extortion, even quadruple extortion continues within ransomware, so that was kind of an easy one. Other things like API attacks, well, I guess we're seeing the beginnings of that, but it's not mainstream, it's not massive. And then there's other sort of maybe smaller black swan type things that have propped up in the meantime, like Log4j recently, for example, that sort of brought to the fore how difficult it is to actually understand what software is running in your environment. Maybe not what products you've bought, but what's under the hood of those products and where it is and how the hell do you find it and patch it. And I think those events really changed the direction of criminal interest and criminal research. So seeing the development of a new attack vector, which is what Log4j represented, and seeing the effectiveness of the exploitation of a vulnerability of that nature, I think has really piqued the interest of cybercriminal groups, and we can expect more attacks taking advantage of those kinds of vulnerabilities in the future. So that was our baselining activity. And then we had to do a whole lot of horizon scanning. So it was looking at open source media, academic research, patent applications, looking for which technologies are just over the horizon, which technologies are evolving in every industry we could think of. And then setting ourselves the task of deciding which of those would be mainstream and which of them would be still emerging and which of them might even die away by 2030. We hadn't written our scenarios at this point, of course. We were just sort of doing the research. But already these sort of key, I did it again, they're not there. These key drivers of change sort of emerged very quickly out of the things that we were seeing. Huge increases in mass automation, giant advances in artificial intelligence, and in particular machine learning for a lot of different industrial applications. Some of the things that really jumped out were specific areas of AI, like natural language processing, and like the generative adversarial networks that are responsible for all the deep fakes that you're seeing today. Where will that take us 10 years from now? And factoring in some of the societal and behavioral changes that we've seen, particularly as a result of the pandemic. So we were talking about these immersive digital environments being fully established by 2030. And this is before the company you all know and love as Facebook became Meta, and before Microsoft made their announcements of the immersive Microsoft Teams environments of the future, the people that had no legs. I don't know if you remember the proof of concept stuff that Microsoft published. So we were saying, as a result of spending so much more time in these online environments forced on us by the pandemic, we become more used to that as a means of interacting, and these fully immersive digital environments become more prevalent by 2030. And there's the concept of additive manufacturing. We already see it in its infancy, and I'm going to go into all of these different things in detail. But like I said, mapping all of these things into this one world of New Saint-Germain meant that we could identify possible points of acceleration, interdependencies, linkages between these technologies, and how each of them would influence the other. And what kind of society would we be looking at? Because the ultimate aim of this is to say, well, faced with that society of 2030, what are the criminal threats that may evolve from that? And how can we best prepare for them now? What are the implications for people like you and me? So, what does the world of 2030 look like for the individual? Certainly, it's a world of increased sensors, a much more pervasive IoT environment. We were talking about things like sensors in clothing, telling you when you've eaten too much, your clothes are a little bit too tight, maybe you need to go up a size. But I was thinking very selfishly and personally about how annoying it is to work out whether or not my kids need new shoes. So wouldn't it be great if your kids had shoes where you don't have to try and find their big toe to see if the shoes are too small or not? The shoe is going to actually send you a notification that says, hey, your kid needs new shoes, get yourself to the shop. So certainly those kinds of commercial sensors around us, on us, in our homes, but also for medical purposes as well. In the paper we talk about a smart contact lens that's consistently measuring your lacrimal fluids, your tears basically, for medical diagnostic purposes. The same with a patch on your skin that could do the same for sweat. And it even went as far as, this was supposed to be a joke when my co-author Vic Baines and I were sitting around throwing ideas around. I casually threw in the idea of a smart toilet because I thought it was funny because I'm still 7 years old. But I was like, one of the most annoying things that a doctor can ever ask you to do is to take a sample. When you get the little plastic pot with the wooden spoon and that's never fun, right? Everyone's going, I've never done that, but it's never fun. So imagine a smart toilet. I don't know if any of you have ever had a poo in Germany, but German toilets have that incredible inspection shelf at the back. You know what I'm talking about? So you can finish, you can stand up and good one, and then flush. Right? And that sparked the idea in me of, what do I know about poo? Not a lot, to be honest. So nice one. I don't know, right, if it's a nice one or not. I've very little to compare it to. So imagine a toilet that takes care of that for you. And imagine a little compartment opens up, your pride and joy drops in, there's analysis, and it's like, off you go, everything's fine, or not. And we're already seeing some of these predictions come true. So that was in, and we'd published, and kind of following things online and on Twitter and stuff, and I saw a project from MIT, which was a smart toilet. I was like, seriously? It wasn't quite as advanced as the thing that I'd imagined, but it was a toilet with a bunch of cameras pointing down the bowl, so that you would deposit your life's work, and when you were finished, the cameras would take pictures and compare, using machine learning, compare the picture of your achievement against other people's great achievements in a huge database and let you know whether or not you were healthy. And this is the kind of thing that's already being worked on. Additive manufacturing is definitely present in the home through the form of 3D printed food. There are already restaurants out there today whose specialization is 3D printed food. And when you think about things like the climate crisis, one of the great things that we can do, which I'm not looking forward to, is giving up meat. And 3D printed meat is already a viable alternative for real dead meat. Can't think of any prettier words for dead animals, dead meat. We speak about education and how education needs to change as well. More so even than now, the sum of all of the world's knowledge is available at our fingertips, right? And in 2030, that's only increasing. And broadly, that's the reason why none of us have to remember telephone numbers anymore, right? I'm sure most of you remember, certainly people with grey on their heads remember, when you were a kid, you had a whole phone book in your head, and now the only phone number I can remember is my phone number when I was 12. That's it. Because we don't need to, so we can outsource that job to our smartphones or to whatever else. And the same is true of basic knowledge. We tend to outsource stuff because someone else, something else is remembering it for us. And education needs to take into account those changes. So education needs to focus much more on processing knowledge, not on acquisition of knowledge. Right now, education is primarily about remembering a whole load of things and then proving that you remembered them by answering questions. But actually, it would be far more helpful to us as a society to teach people how effectively to process information, to take information from multiple sources, to establish what's real and what's unreal, and to have much more critical thinking, better judgment. Another area in the research that I don't know if it's creepy or crazy or fantastic is the concept of immortality. So can we achieve immortality by 2030? And I don't mean, obviously, physical immortality, but the prospect of living forever digitally, never having to die. So imagine an AI that is with you all the time. It reads all of your messages in and out, your emails, if you're still doing email by 2030, listens in on your phone calls, your everyday conversations. I mean, we're pretty close to that now anyway, right, with all the devices that we surround ourselves with. Maybe you even sit down once a week or once a day with your artificial you, your digital you, infini-me's are what we called them in the research, and have a conversation. How do you feel about what happened today? What did happen today? What was your reaction? Who did you speak to? And then this AI knows increasingly more about who you are, what drives you, what are your motivations. And when you die, it becomes you and continues living online in your place. We achieve digital immortality. By 2030, I don't think that's unreasonable, but is it good? As these infinities begin to gain agency, they can engage in antisocial behavior. As the person that they were initially learning from has gone away, they begin to learn by themselves and stop being you and start to become someone else. Maybe they even engage in criminal behavior. So you're faced with the prospect of grieving relatives looking for legal remedies to stop their loved ones from being turned off, or maybe even to ensure that they are. I'm glad someone laughed at that. That's the first time anyone's ever laughed at that, so there's something going on down there. And then, of course, playing into that is this whole concept of neural linking. That Elon Musk's Neuralink is just one example. I'm sure many of you have seen Ready Player One, the film, or read the book of Ready Player One. And there was that concept of the full-body sort of haptic feedback suit thing. That looks quaint already. That looks old-fashioned already. We're going to skip that. There'll be no need for a full-body haptic suit. Because if you have a neural link, you don't need to physically feel something, because you only actually feel it in your brain anyway, right? So if you have that link, who cares about the Ready Player One suit? So that's some of the stuff that's in 2030 for the individual. If we look at a company, our protagonist, we've written these as 3 scenarios. Our protagonist works for a company called Consolidated Rubber and Logistics. They're a 200-year-old manufacturing organization. They retooled their production lines during the Great Pandemic of 10 years before to start making protective equipment, and brought them firmly into the medical supply chain. But the self-healing polymers that they make are used in environments as diverse as the bottom of the ocean, in undersea cabling. Imagine cables that can heal themselves at the bottom of the ocean, all the way out to the edges of the atmosphere in satellite. They manufacture in a way we've called 4D printing. So think of the advantages if you're making something that needs space transit to a satellite, for example. Think of the advantages if you could IKEA that, if you could flat pack that thing. And yet when it got to where it needs to be, on an external stimulus like Bluetooth, wireless, GPS, whatever it might be, it opens up and changes form and factor into what it needs to be at its end destination. That's the concept of 4D printing. All of these production lines are smart, all of them are connected, fully pervasive 5G by then, of course, which means that those production lines and industrial facilities have a digital twin in the cloud. And that digital twin gets real-time information from the production line. So it's an accurate to the second image of what's physically happening on the ground, which is great for just-in-time maintenance, it's great for testing out configuration changes, but all of this, of course, massively broadens the attack surface. With all of these connected devices, connected production lines. But it also means that the process of manufacturing things is becoming ever more merged in with the existing DevOps processes within those businesses. So now it's not just about the making of code and pushing it into operations. It's about actually the making of physical devices through their design, manufacture, implementation, and moving into production. And that process has become known as DevOps or MakeOps in our future world. When it comes to threats, obviously data theft is still a concern. That's not going to go away. Companies and individuals are still worried about having data stolen. But in this kind of very connected, highly automated world with relying on algorithmic operation, data modification attacks are becoming increasingly of a concern to organizations in 2030. Think of the mental processes behind a ransomware attack today and apply it to a data modification attack in the future. And actually, you can think of a scenario where the attack doesn't even need to have happened. That's not me. It's probably my mum. The attack doesn't actually need to have happened, because if I can contact your organization with a credible threat that says, hey, by the way, I've done something really bad to your data, and your manufacturing process relies on that learning pool. And if someone can credibly say to you, I've tainted your learning pool, then what choice do you have as an organization except to halt production, stop making those aeroplane wings until you can be sure that they're exactly correct as they are supposed to be? Because at the moment, we don't have the security tools, the digital tools, to assure data integrity at such a scale. And yet we increasingly rely on that scale of data for automated decision-making and manufacturing, for example. So data manipulation attacks, or even just the threat of data manipulation attacks in the future, is a very real concern. And then the third scenario was 2030 for the state, for the government, and for the citizens of that state. You can imagine some of the concerns with increased data capture, sensors everywhere, more knowledge about all of us. Governments are grappling with the notion of a single digital identity and all of the cross-profiling. We have some examples of how that could be used, both for good and for bad in the paper. So we profile in one company, we're saying if people are recycling their household waste more effectively, then they get reduced rates on public transport, which creates like a virtuous circle. You recycle more, which means you get cheaper bus fares, which means you drive your car less, which means less pollution, which is great. So you're incentivizing good behavior through correlation of data. But in the neighboring state of East Saint-Gobain, which is not quite so nice, they've been doing the same kind of profiling to ban undesirable people from teaching for fear that they might corrupt the young in their schools. The city or the state of New Saint-Gobain has a digital currency, a national digital currency, but that currency doesn't offer anonymity. So we look at some of the impacts on the cybercriminal economy from a digital fiat currency that doesn't offer the anonymity that we see today. And something that really struck me as increasingly important is in a world where we are more used to interacting with synthetic influences, so real-looking people in immersive environments who have never existed, but whose purpose is there to change what we think and change our beliefs. When our politicians appear virtually, when our movie stars never actually acted in the film, they just licensed out their likeness and their voice, and they're working on 7 or 8 films at the same time because they don't actually have to show up. In a world where we're used to interacting with family and friends at a distance, and they look and sound exactly like family and friends, but maybe they can choose what skin they're wearing at the time, then think of how much more difficult it will be to resist and how much more effective influence operations campaigns will be in a world like that, where if I can pretend to be someone you know, someone you trust, someone you respect, whatever it might be, then the power and the immediacy of an immersive environment, which is a fully fledged conversation with someone you know, the ability of that to alter belief systems and to change the way that people think will be incredibly stronger. One of the great problems of the world of 2030 between nation states, and this is even more relevant now if we look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what's happening in that country right now, is a moratorium, international moratorium on autonomous kinetic weaponry, fully autonomous kinetic weaponry. Not the drones that we see today, but imagine a drone that you can simply throw up into the air and walk away from. We already have the concept of loitering munitions, but they still have a human operator. Imagine one that can select its target and engage on its own terms without any human interaction. So there's a United Nations moratorium on the development of those weapons, but of course, can we trust every nation state to abide by the terms of those kinds of moratoria? And I guess we already know that the answer is no to that. And then a couple of the technologies we leave as in development is the practice of data storage in synthetic DNA and the precise date of effective quantum decryption. Didn't have enough certainty to put them on that 2030 timeline. But when I was thinking about storing data in synthetic DNA, think of the conspiracy theories that we're going to see when that starts to happen. Think of the fact that coronavirus vaccines just had the NA in some of them, right? And how much that drove people crazy. Like, they're altering my DNA by giving me an injection and Bill Gates is going to marry my wife and all kinds of whatever it was. Think about the conspiracy theories you could build about storing our data in synthetic DNA and the rise of the cyborgs. If you don't have enough knowledge, it's very easy to make you believe whatever you want. So the cyber threats that we see in the world of 2030, the categories that they fall into are probably very familiar. Unauthorized exposure of data and access to data, data manipulation, service disruption, all of the kinds of things that you're used to seeing. But the next decade promises to be one where machine learning and AI has really permeated every level of every aspect of our society. It's present in our homes, it's present in our education, in our production lines, in our governments. And there's no reason to assume that by the end of this decade, the industry of cybercrime will be any different. They will be very attracted to tools that make things like target selection, reconnaissance and profiling, initial compromise, discovery of zero-day vulnerabilities, for example, that's able to automate all of that. Maybe even initial colonization of a target. Maybe you just give your AI the instruction set that says, hey, go out and find me some people who work in oil and gas, some companies who work in oil and gas. Come back when you've colonized them and I'll tell you what to do next. That would be super attractive to organized crime groups. But of course, the nature of AI very often is that its user doesn't understand why and how it's doing what it's doing, whether for good or for bad. So perhaps the fact that criminals don't quite understand the tools that they're using may offer some unexpected opportunities for its disruption by law enforcement, by security organizations. We'll have to wait and see. They will also be using AI for more advanced evasion techniques to hide, where the attack is coming from and what the motivations are. But one of the big problems for defenders will be that everything we've learned as an industry and as practitioners has been learned because we face a human adversary, right? We've learned how to defend against other people using digital tools, but against other people that think like people. And AI is not constrained by human thought processes. It makes decisions in its own way. It doesn't have to think the way that you do or the way that I do. And the most simplistic example of that I can think of is to consider my own relationship with a banana. If you give a human a banana, they look at the banana and they say, this looks like a handle, so I'm going to grab the handle and that's how I'm going to open the banana. But if you give a monkey a banana, they don't have a human brain and they completely ignore the handle because they don't get the concept of a handle for opening things. They turn the banana around and simply squeeze the end and peel it like that, and it's actually much more effective. They're not constrained to considering the object in the way that we do. And the same will be true of combating AI-driven criminal activity. So it really does become AI against AI in the future, because an AI stands a much greater chance of, even by trial and error at speed, working out what the hell is going on than we would in those situations. So the implications of all of this for cybersecurity stakeholders are many. The document itself that I'm talking about, if you want to read it, by the way, it's at 2030.trendmicro.com. It's almost 40 pages of research. So I've really compressed it for the purposes of this presentation. Definitely, the lowest tier of practitioner that, in a security operations center, for example, a tier 1 operative in a SOC, they're not going to be doing that donkey work of triage anymore. That will be taken care of by machine learning. So the profession of cybersecurity will be much more about building and maintaining policies, deciding on policies, and critically explaining actions taken by AI, understanding what has happened and why it has happened, and justifying that. Everything is pushed out to the edge and the cloud. We see that happening already. And as you can see, it's a long list. But for me, the one that really stood out the most, I don't know if you're familiar with the feeling, but when you're writing a piece of research, you're very deep in what you're writing and what you're thinking about as you're putting it all together, and then the next time when it's finished, you read it looking for grammatical errors and spelling mistakes and punctuation errors, and then you send it away to somebody else to make it look nice. And it's only when it comes back looking nice that you get the luxury of sitting down and saying, all right, what was I actually writing about? What's the underlying theme of this document? And when I read through 2030, what jumped out at me was that last one, truth, trust, and authenticity. I think it's at the core of what we were writing about. Already now, our accepted notions of truth, trust, and authenticity are very much under threat. I think that's undeniable. And that will be our greatest challenge over the next decade, telling the real from the unreal, fact from fiction, fantasy from reality. So we really need to focus on giving citizens a greater critical distance and ability to make those intellectual choices, but also on the development and deployment of technical authenticity tools to help us achieve that in commercial environments. If you're interested, we turned the white paper into a 9-episode science fiction series to kind of try and bring the world to life. I'll leave you with a 60-second trailer to hopefully give you a flavor of that, and maybe you'll go away and have a look at the episodes. And thanks very much for listening.
There has never been a greater need, a stronger calling to stand in the vanguard of innovation to change the world for the better.
We have a critical situation. Our edge computing capability is seriously degraded.
Come on, Dad, I thought we could all sit down and have dinner together.
We're now receiving a lot of calls from our medical partners describing what looks like a cascading failure of all our first-generation implants.
Dad? Hello? Dad, say something. Dad!
People know that something is up, and if we don't keep them in the loop, they'll assume that we're hiding something.
I was the first one there getting my hands dirty when no one gave a... all those people dead and their families.
How a corporation of your stature is slower than a streaming journalist.
When you're changing the world, sometimes
Sometimes you can accidentally kill people.
What I'm about to show you is shocking.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.